There are moments in life when a single misjudgment can change a person's entire destiny, and sometimes that very same moment can cause a multi-billion-dollar corporation to collapse like a sandcastle in the waves. Imagine this. You board a plane, sit in the seat you paid for. Not just any seat, but a first-class one. You just want to be quiet, lean back, and take a deep breath. And then a few minutes later, you're dragged down the aisle under dozens of stares. Not because you did anything wrong, but because people think you don't deserve that seat. If that happened to you, what would you do? Would you silently endure it, or would you stand up for yourself even if it meant fighting? And if a call from you could cost the entire airline $5 billion, would you dial the number? If this story resonates with you, please leave a like, share, and subscribe to the channel before we embark on this emotional journey. Now, let's begin. The morning sky over New York that day wasn't particularly beautiful, nor was it anything special. It was like 1,000 other mornings across America, slightly cool, slightly damp, and with the faint scent of coffee from the small cafes around JFK Airport. But perhaps ordinary days often conceal unforeseen events. Marcus Hale stood silently under the awning in front of Terminal 4. An old brown leather bag, which had accompanied him through dozens of countries, rested neatly on his shoulder. From a distance, you'd think he was just an ordinary man, 1.85 meters tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a simple charcoal-colored hoodie. No luxury accessories, no diamond watch, no designer shoes. Just Marcus with a calm demeanor that instilled a sense of security. Few people know that this man is the CEO of Halestone Capital, a multi-billion-dollar investment fund. And even fewer know that he was once a trembling black boy standing at this very airport watching his mother being berated by a security officer simply for mispronouncing a word in English. That memory, like an old wound, still stings every time he walks through security. Marcus doesn't live in the past, but he hasn't forgotten it. He believes that his composure today, his success, is partly built upon the humiliations he once experienced. He doesn't resent it, only regrets that the world at times isn't as kind as he hoped. Today, he's flying to London to sign an important deal. His private jet is undergoing maintenance in Denver, so he's chosen to fly commercial. He likes that nostalgic feeling being immersed in the crowds, seeing families reunited, weary but hopeful travelers, diverse faces jostling through the ticket gates. America, in his eyes, is still beautiful in a very human way. Atlas Air Flight 771. Departure at 10:55 a.m. Seat 1A, first class. Marcus nodded slightly upon receiving the confirmation message. Seat 1A was the quietest corner by the window with no one to disturb him. He hoped for a smooth flight. 6 hours in the air was a good amount of time to refine his presentation or catch up on sleep after 3 consecutive nights of work. But sometimes the simplest desires are the hardest to hold on to. As he checked the papers in his jacket pocket, a cold wind swept through the glass corridor, carrying the chaotic sounds of the airport. The loudspeaker announcements hurried, footsteps, crying children. In that moment, he felt a sudden unease, not anxiety, but a premonition, a feeling, as if something was about to happen, something significant. Mr. Hale, Elena Brooks's voice came through the phone. Don't forget to bring the printed copy of the contract. Jason left it in your bag last night. Marcus chuckled. If he forgets again, I'll give him a week off to teach him a lesson. I'll repeat it exactly as it was said. Elena giggled. Have a safe flight. Thanks, Elena. I'll text you when I arrive. He hung up the phone and walked into the priority queue. People moved aside, making way for him even though they didn't know who he was. Perhaps it was because his demeanor always inspired an unspoken sense of respect. As he approached the boarding gate, he caught sight of a man leaning against the check-in counter, a dark blue vest, a slightly askew tie, and a glass of wine with a strong alcoholic aroma. His face was flushed, the kind of flush you get from drinking all morning. It was Victor Langford. He didn't know his name at the time, only saw a look of intense displeasure sweep over him. A look Marcus had encountered 1,000 times in his life, the look of someone who believed they had the right to judge others by the color of their skin and the clothes they wore. But Marcus didn't mind. He was used to it, and he had a long journey ahead of him. When the plane's doors opened, he stepped into first class. The space was luxurious but slightly dated with warm yellow lighting. The scent of leather seats mingled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. He liked this feeling like a small, peaceful corner amidst the hustle and bustle of life. Marcus placed his bag in the overhead compartment and sat down in seat 1A. He pulled out his phone and opened his calendar. The whole trip was about work. But as he leaned back, he suddenly thought, if only this flight could be peaceful. Because he didn't know, in just a few minutes, the very chair he was sitting in would be the start of a storm that would shake the entire United States. That morning, as Marcus Hale sat in compartment 1A and quietly fastened his seatbelt, he had no idea that his life was about to take an unexpected turn. But the way he leaned back, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath revealed one thing: this man was accustomed to life's unexpected detours. Marcus always lived a pace one step slower than the rest of the world. Not because he was slow, but because he observed. He listened. He felt. Perhaps also because he had to learn to read the slightest nuances in other people's eyes to know whether they believed him or not. It wasn't easy for a black child growing up in an old Atlanta neighborhood. Marcus's father died when he was only 9 years old. His mother, Linda Hale, was the strongest woman he had ever known. She worked 2 jobs at once, a kitchen assistant in a small diner in the mornings and a janitor in a school in the afternoons. For her, kindness was the only thing that could never be lost, no matter how much life tore everything else apart. But there was one day that Marcus would never forget for the rest of his life. He was only 12 years old. He and his mother were flying from Atlanta to New York to visit relatives. It was his first time flying. Marcus clearly remembered his mother choosing her prettiest dress, a pale floral dress she only wore on special occasions. She carefully held the tickets, a small smile on her face as they stood at the security check. But that smile vanished instantly when a security guard shouted, "Step back, ma'am! Your documents don't look valid!" His voice was cold and full of suspicion. Not suspicion of the documents, suspicion of the person. Marcus's mother stammered an explanation, mispronouncing a few English words. The employee shouted even louder, drawing attention from everyone around. Little Marcus, standing behind his mother, clutched his backpack, strapped tightly, his heart pounding. He remembered that feeling clearly. The feeling of helplessness. The feeling of shame even though he had done nothing wrong. The feeling of being seen as if he were something suspicious, something to be scrutinized more closely than others. Finally, another officer came to double-check the paperwork. Everything was in order. His mother was allowed to continue. But Marcus knew that from that moment on, the world would never be simple for him again. In cabin 1A today, that memory returned as gently as a breath. It wasn't as painful as before, but it was still enough to calm his heart. Marcus opened his eyes and looked out the window. The plane's doors were still open, and the light from the runway cast a pale yellow glow on his face, creating a warm yet slightly melancholic feeling. Marcus's success wasn't due to him being more talented than anyone else. He succeeded because he had to work twice as hard to prove himself in rooms where people automatically doubted him. In meetings, the gaze directed at him wasn't one of curiosity, but of challenge. In the seemingly harmless whispers, yet enough to create an invisible barrier, does he have experience? He doesn't look like a CEO. He's probably just being favored because of the diversification policy. Marcus wasn't angry with anyone about it. He just remembered. The atmosphere on the plane began to liven up. A young flight attendant walked over and placed a warm towel on each passenger's desk. A faint scent of oranges wafted through the air. People started adjusting their seats, opening their laptops, and sending last-minute messages. An elderly woman was struggling to reach for her luggage, and Marcus immediately stood up to help her. "Thank you, sweetheart," she smiled gently. "It's nothing," Marcus replied in a soft, typical Southern American accent. That small moment made him feel good. He always believed that kindness had a strange power. A tiny act could make someone's whole day better, and he hopes it will be the same today. But sitting a few seats away from him, Victor Langford was exhaling a thick cloud of alcohol fumes. He placed his whiskey glass down on the table with a distinct clink. The atmosphere around him felt unsettling, as if the entire cabin had become more cramped simply because of his presence. Victor had been watching Marcus from the moment he stepped up. Not a casual glance, but a judgmental, scrutinizing look. A look so familiar to Marcus that he could tell what it contained with just a glance. Judgment, a slight contempt, and a silent question. Why is he sitting here? Marcus paid no heed. He opened his small notebook where he had jotted down some unfinished ideas for the community project he was developing, a scholarship program for black teenagers to study aviation. He believed that if he wanted to change the system, he had to get his own children involved first. The airplane cabin gradually filled with passengers. A young family walked by the child, giggling at the sight of the reclining seat that transformed into a bed. A businessman tried to speak softly on the phone so as not to disturb others. A flight attendant reminded everyone to put their suitcases in the correct place. Everyday life. Very ordinary life. And because he was so ordinary, Marcus couldn't have known that in just a few minutes, this seat 1A, would become the center of attention for the whole world. When the clock on the cabin wall struck 1048, Marcus leaned back in his seat and closed his notebook. He wasn't expecting anything. A quiet flight, a little rest, maybe a hot cup of tea, but fate did not ask for his opinion. The cockpit door was ajar, and from the rear compartment came a familiar voice, reeking of alcohol and overflowing with excessive confidence. "That's my seat. 1A. I. Sit there. Not you." Marcus opened his eyes. No sigh, no frown, just looked in the direction of the sound. The first wave has begun to come ashore, and he knew that in moments like these, what he chose to do would shape everything that happened next. Seat 1A was always a quiet little corner. No one walked by, no one jostled. For Marcus Hale, it was like a safe space in the vast sky, a place where he could escape the hustle and bustle of life. But that moment didn't last long. The clinking sound of the whiskey glass being placed on the table echoed again. Marcus immediately sensed a subtle change in the atmosphere, something tense, like a guitar string being tightened halfway. "Did you hear me, Victor?" Langford's voice came through, not loud, but full of suppressed frustration. "I said that's my seat." Marcus turned his head. He looked at Victor not with a confrontational gaze, but with the kind of look an adult gives a drunk person, calm, gentle, and somewhat sympathetic. "Sir, this is seat 1, Marcus said, shrugging. "That's what my ticket says." Victor burst out laughing. A laugh that was half drunk, half arrogant, as if all the explanations were a joke. "Do you know who I am? I've always sat in this seat. For 3 years now." He pointed to himself. Victor Langford, Platinum Premier Member. Marcus was silent for a few seconds. He could see clearly in Victor's eyes that it wasn't a misunderstanding about the position. It was a misunderstanding about the person. A type of person who believes their social standing allows them to stand above others even when the truth is against them. "Mr. Langford, is that you?" Marcus asked slowly. "I have no doubt about your membership level. I only know that my ticket is for seat 1A and I'm sitting in the right seat." Victor blinked, perhaps unaccustomed to such a gentle yet firm refusal. He turned around. "Carol!" he shouted. Carol, Chief Flight Attendant Carol Dunley, hurried forward. Her face bore the weary lines of someone who had worked in the industry for too long and no longer had the energy for kindness. She saw Victor, saw the glass of wine, and then saw Marcus. "What's the matter, Mr. Langford?" "What's going on?" Victor gestured towards Marcus. "This person is sitting in my seat. 1A. I need seat 1A for this flight. You work here, you know that." Carol turned to Marcus, but her gaze quickly shifted from his hoodie to his casual sneakers. She hadn't looked at her boarding pass, but Marcus could clearly see what was going through her mind. Try to fix the format. Try to categorize. Try to put him in the passengers can be moved to another seat without complaining box. A small void in his heart was being squeezed. Sir Carol said in a businesslike tone, "You may be mistaken. Seat 1A is usually reserved for members." "I know," Marcus replied softly, "but my ticket is 1A. If you don't mind, could you please double-check?" Carol frowned slightly as if he had made too much of a request. "Okay, let me see." Marcus handed her the phone with the boarding pass. Carol didn't touch it, just glanced at it. A quick glance, too fast to really read, but long enough for her to decide she didn't believe it. "Mr. Langford has been in this chair for 3 years, Carol said. "We want to maintain consistency for our high-end guests." "And what about me?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but with a hint of tension at the end. "I paid in full for this seat." Carol paused, unsure how to respond without losing face. Finally, she simply said, "He can sit in seat 4C. It's spacious and airy, just not seat 1A. Victor smirked, taking another sip of wine. "You heard it." Marcus looked at both of them. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. He said nothing, but that silence seemed to condense the air in the cabin into a choked sob. "I'm not moving seats," Marcus said, enunciating each word clearly, "unless there's a valid reason." Carol breathed heavily. Are you making things difficult, sir? I just want you to check the proper procedure. Marcus's voice remained unchanged. I suggest you review the manifest. Carol turned to another flight attendant and whispered something. The attendant hurried away. Victor crossed his arms, leaned against the overhead compartment, and wore a smug smile. In that moment, Marcus felt his heart slow down. Not out of fear, not out of anger, but because of something very familiar. He had experienced these moments far too many times before. The moment he realized, even though he had gone far away, there were still people who looked at him like the frightened little boy standing at the checkpoint all those years ago. The cockpit door swung open. Captain Reynolds stepped out. Tall, with a slightly protruding belly, his steps heavy but confident. He could immediately guess the type of man, a seasoned pilot who believed his word was law unquestionable. "What's wrong?" Reynolds asked. Carol immediately recounted the story, but not in chronological order, but rather emotionally, from her perspective, from her own biases. When she said he refuses to cooperate, Marcus knew things were starting to slip out of his hands. Captain Reynolds looked Marcus up and down. "Sir, we don't want to delay the flight. Please move to seat 4C. Marcus looked up. The dim light in the cabin reflected in his eyes, making them appear deep and still like a dark lake. Captain Marcus said, "I suggest you follow the proper procedure. My ticket is 1A. She can double-check the manifest. That's all." Reynolds folded his arms. "So you refuse to comply?" "I am not refusing to comply with the regulations. I am refusing to comply with a wrongful judgment." Something flickered across Reynolds' eyes. Not understanding. It was unease. A long silence ensued. The plane seemed to hold its breath. Other passengers began to take notice. A few looked up from their books. Some exchanged awkward glances. Everyone sensed this wouldn't end well. Victor broke the silence with a provocative remark. "Oh my God, Captain. It's just a passenger who got in the wrong seat. Just drag him away and we're done." The words fell into the cabin like a stone thrown into a calm lake, and ripples began to spread. Marcus clenched his fists. Not out of anger, but out of disappointment. A disappointment so deep it was indescribable. A low voice came from the rear compartment. "What's going on? That man doesn't look like he did anything wrong." Marcus heard it. "And that weighed even more heavily on him," Reynolds gestured. "Carol, call airport security. A cold, indifferent yes." Marcus closed his eyes. He opened them. He didn't resist. He didn't say anything more. He didn't beg. He didn't try to prove anything. But he knew very well they had just chosen the wrong person to humiliate, and he knew somehow their choice would come at a price. As Carol Dunley turned and walked away to call airport security, Marcus Hale sat in silence. Not the silence of weakness, but the silence of someone who understood a storm was coming, and he was standing in the eye of it, yet his heart was frighteningly calm. Victor Langford folded his arms, took another sip of whiskey, a smirk playing on his lips as if he'd just won a small bet. Captain Reynolds stood waiting near the cockpit door, his gaze a mixture of annoyance and excessive confidence. Confident that he was doing the right thing. Confident that his position allowed him to judge others without being held accountable for those judgments. Marcus just looked out the window. A service car was driving across the runway. The light from the car's metal reflected off the glass. Everything was strangely normal. So normal it was. Heartbreaking. He thought of his mother. He thought of the times she had been rejected, looked down upon, yet she still said to him, "Marcus, you don't need to raise your voice to prove you're worthy. You just need to stand tall." And he lived like that for 38 years. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the back of the cabin. 2 JFK airport security officers appeared. They wore black vests and walked quickly, forcefully, and decisively. One was tall with a stony face. The other was shorter, but his eyes were sharp and vigilant. The entire first-class cabin fell silent. A few passengers pretended to read newspapers, but their eyes still darted through the window. Others, especially the older group, looked annoyed but dared not say anything. The younger ones turned on their phone cameras. Because in this day and age, even a seemingly small matter can become breaking news in an instant. Carol turned around and led the 2 security officers to seat 1A. "Here," she said, her voice sounding as if she were handing over proof of a crime. The higher-ranking security officer asked, "Sir, what is your name, Marcus Hale?" Marcus's voice was as soft as if he were calling out his name during roll call. "Mr. Hale, the captain asked you to leave the aircraft for failing to follow the flight crew's instructions." Marcus looked him straight in the eye. I didn't violate any guidelines. I was just asking for proper procedure, a manifest check. This is the chair I bought. The employee shook his head. Sir, we don't handle seat changes. We handle compliance. And you are refusing to change seats, as requested by the flight crew. A faint sigh escaped a passenger. Marcus clearly heard a whisper. He didn't do anything, but that voice was too small to change anything. Sir, please disembark, the security officer said a second time, his voice firmer. Marcus knew what would happen next. He'd seen similar videos. But for it to happen to him, it was always a completely different experience. I will leave the plane, Marcus said, his voice low and strangely calm. But I will not stand up until you confirm that I am being asked to leave, despite having done nothing wrong. The security guard frowned. Are you resisting arrest? No, Marcus replied. I just want everything to be said truthfully. Victor let out a sarcastic laugh. Good heavens, what a drama. Let him off, I have to go to London for dinner. Marcus turned to look at him, not angry, just sad. The shorter employee stepped forward. If you don't stand, we'll be forced to assist you off the plane. Marcus said nothing. He closed his eyes. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. He opened his eyes. Okay. But that yes wasn't an agreement to stand up. It was an acceptance that this had to happen. And he wouldn't bow down. He wouldn't beg. He wouldn't play the role of the docile man to make others feel good. The employee reached out and touched Marcus's arm. Stand up, sir. Excuse me, Marcus said softly, don't touch me. But the other man grabbed his wrist. In an instant, the calm shattered. Not from Marcus, but from the entire system. The attendant yanked hard. Seat 1, bounced back. The glass of water on the table spilled onto the floor. A cry of, "Oh my God," rang out from compartment 1D. And then, the entire cabin exploded with gasps, rustling pockets, and cameras snapping open en masse. A second pull. Marcus steadied himself, trying not to fall onto the elderly woman beside him. A third pull, stronger, more violent. His hoodie was squeezed tightly against his shoulder. He was dragged from his seat like a worthless object. No one said anything. No one stopped them. Only the phones were raised, as emotionless as cold eyes. Marcus didn't resist. He let them drag him through the passageway, the sound of his shoes scraping against the airplane carpet. A loud thud as his shoulder hit the back of seat 1C. A small groan escaped his lips, but he didn't say a word. As they pulled him toward the plane door, he looked up just in time to see Victor, offering him a glass of whiskey, a smirk on his face. Good luck, man. You've chosen the wrong place to cause trouble. Marcus looked him straight in the eye. No anger, no fear. Just one glance that Victor would remember for the rest of his life. A glance that said he had ignited the engine of a storm. The airplane door swung open. Cold air blew in from the jet bridge. Marcus was dragged off the plane. The employee held him back to handcuff him, but Marcus said, "I'm leaving. No more violence needed." They're still handcuffed. It's procedure, they say. As he was being led away, a passenger stood up and said, "That's discrimination, I saw it all." But no one else dared to say anything more. In that moment, as the metal of the handcuffs tightened around his wrists, Marcus Hale knew one thing. He wasn't just dragged off an airplane. He was pulled down from any illusion that the system had changed. But he also knew, when someone attacks his honor, he will not respond with shouting. He will retaliate with power they are unaware he possesses. The storm started here. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind Marcus Hale, the sound echoing against the cold gray wall like the final verdict of a sentence he never committed. The detention room at JFK Airport wasn't large. Just a table, 2 plastic chairs, and pale white neon lights that made everything seem more weary than it actually was. Marcus sat upright, his hands resting on his lap. Red marks from the metal handcuffs still clung to his wrists. He didn't look down, nor did he rub his hands. The pain didn't bother him. What weighed most heavily on his heart was a familiar feeling he thought he'd left behind long ago, the feeling of being seen as a threat simply for his existence. A police officer walked in. He looked like someone who had spent too many nights on duty, too many pointless fights. But his eyes, when he looked at Marcus, held a hidden meaning, a hint of unease, a touch of apprehension, as if he were trying to piece together fragments of information. "Mr. Hale," the officer said, his voice not as stern as airport security's, but not exactly friendly either. "We're reviewing the report. You may have to sign a statement regarding your resistance to the flight crew. Marcus looked straight ahead. I'm not objecting. I'm just requesting a manifest inspection. The company said he wasn't cooperating. Marcus pursed his lips slightly. Non-cooperation, or refusal to comply with an unreasonable request. The police officer sighed. Well, I'm just taking statements. The decision is up to the company. Marcus nodded slightly. I understand. But in reality, he understood much more than that. He understood that in this society, sometimes the truth isn't what matters. What matters is who speaks the truth. A long silence ensued. The small room seemed to shrink. Then the police officer looked at Marcus again longer and more intensely. I've seen the video, he said softly. You didn't do anything wrong. Marcus wasn't surprised. He knew the truth would eventually reveal itself. Thank you, Marcus said. I can't help you much, the police officer replied. But you have the right to make a call. Marcus nodded. I know who I'm going to call. He placed the landline phone down in front of Marcus, then left, closing the door behind him. The room fell silent. Marcus placed his hand on the phone but didn't pick it up immediately. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. This wasn't anger. This was a choice. For the first time in a long time, he heard his mother's voice in his memory. Marcus, when you have to stand up for yourself, stand up with intelligence, not with shouting. He opened his eyes, and he dialed the number. The call only rang once. The person on the other end of the line answered quickly, a sharp, professional female voice, yet still tinged with anxiety. Marcus, oh my God, I just saw the video. That was Elena Brooks, Marcus's invaluable assistant, someone who understood him better than many of his longtime colleagues. Marcus spoke each word with a terrifying calmness. Elena, call the legal department, and activate Directive 9. The other side was silent for a second. Marcus, Directive 9 is the highest order. It will directly affect Atlas Air. Are you sure? Absolutely, Marcus replied. They didn't just insult me. They insulted the system we operate. This isn't just about a chair anymore. Elena sighed, but not hesitantly. It was the sigh of someone who knew they were about to activate a mechanism powerful enough to blow away an entire corporation. Okay, I'll assemble the advisory team in 10 minutes. Thank you, Marcus said softly. Marcus, do you want me to notify Atlas's board of directors beforehand? Marcus stared at the gray wall, the neon lights reflecting off his eyes, making them look like two pieces of black glass. No, he said. Let them see for themselves on the news. Elena chuckled softly, a chuckle that was somewhat mischievous. Understood. I understand. The call has ended, but a war has just begun. Marcus put down the receiver and leaned back in his chair. For the first time in 30 minutes, he let his body relax. Not because he was tired, but because he was calculating. In his mind, everything was being pieced together according to the cold logic of a CEO who had once saved dozens of multi-billion-dollar deals times Atlas Air is leasing 62% of its fleet from Skyfleet Holdings. Asterisk, Halistone Capital holds a 28% stake in Skyfleet. Asterisk, Marcus acquired an additional 4% personal stake. Asterisk, the conduct breach clause in the operating contract. Asterisk, the Executive Dignity Protection Clause, which Marcus himself proposed 2 years ago. Therefore, dragging him off the plane was not just a personal insult. It was a breach of ethical principles toward senior shareholders, a clause that few people remember, except for the person who wrote it, older brother. Marcus closed his eyes, inhaled, exhaled. Not too fast, not too slow. The rhythm of someone who knows that victory or defeat lies not in the shout, but in the timing of the strike. There was a knock on the door. The police officer from earlier entered, carrying a few papers. Mr. Hale, he said, his voice cautious. There's news. Marcus looked up. The police officer handed him the iPad from the desk. The story of him being dragged off the plane is now on CNN. Marcus wasn't surprised, but he looked at the screen. The image shows him being dragged from his seat, his eyes unusually calm, a stark contrast to the chaos in the cabin. The video shakes with screams and curses mingling. A woman shouts, "He didn't do anything." The text, scrolling below, reads, "Black CEO forcefully removed from flight, despite holding valid first-class ticket." The police officer whispered, "You're becoming famous, and the company is in big trouble." Marcus didn't answer, but he knew this was just the spark. The real fire will start when Directive 9 is activated. In the executive office of Hallistone Capital, Elena is undoubtedly holding an emergency meeting. The legal team is reviewing the contracts. Venture capital funds have caught wind of the volatility. Rumors will spread quickly. Atlas stock, it's about to be shaken. And all of this was due to a misjudgment and an arrogant decision by a few people on the plane. A little while later, the police officer returned. "Mr. Hale, we've reviewed the video. You will not be prosecuted. You may leave." Marcus stood up, not in a hurry, not gloating. He only asked one question. Did the company apologize? The police officer was silent for a few seconds, then shook his head. No. They said he was an uncooperative passenger. Marcus looked down at his wrist. The handcuffs were still there. "So," he said, adjusting his hoodie, "they've chosen their own path." The policeman looked at him, his gaze a mixture of respect and concern. "What are you planning to do?" Marcus replied in a low but cold voice that seemed to drop several degrees in temperature. "Me, I'll only do one thing." The policeman waited. Marcus replied, "I will show them the price of contempt." A silence. Then he walked out of the room, his steps slow, as if he weren't leaving the detention room, but rather leaving an old chapter of his life. The door opened, and sunlight streamed in. And from that moment on, Marcus Hale was no longer someone being dragged away from the 1A seat. He's the man pulling a $5 billion airline to the brink of collapse. The afternoon sun in New York wasn't too strong, but the light casting a soft golden glow on the sidewalk made everything seem more peaceful than it actually was. But there was nothing peaceful in Marcus Hale's mind as he walked out of airport security. No paparazzi. No news outlets. Only a few people recognized him from the viral video, but they kept their distance, hesitant to approach. In some strange way, Marcus's composure discouraged them from bothering him. He didn't look like someone who had just been dragged off a plane. He looked like someone about to do something game-changer. A gentle breeze blew through his hoodie. He glanced at his phone. 215 unread messages, 30 missed calls, all from partners, advisors, and friends in the finance industry. But he only called one person, Elena, he said, when the line connected. "Have you left yet?" Elena asked, her voice urgent but still maintaining the absolute professionalism of someone who had been by his side for 10 years. "Okay, everything's fine." No one was hurt except for their pride. Elena sighed. It was unclear whether it was out of relief or because she knew things were turning more dangerous. Directive 9 has been implemented. The legal department is drafting a formal notice to Skyfleet Holdings. They will activate the ethics violation clause against Atlas Air. "How much longer?" Marcus asked. "The fax will be sent in about 15 minutes. But..." Elena hesitated. "Marcus, are you prepared for a chain reaction?" Marcus walked slowly down the steps, his voice even. "Elena, do you think I activated Directive 9 just to warn them?" "No," Elena replied. "He activated it because he'd had enough." Marcus said nothing. There was no need to say anything. Elena continued. "We also notified the market analysis department. When the fax was sent, Atlas Air was practically in the red. I think the stock will plummet before the market closes." Marcus leaned against a stone pillar near the exit. A yellow taxi sped past, the sound of its engine mingling with the wind. "Their stock won't just drop sharply," Marcus said slowly. "It will drop vertically." Elena was silent for a second. Then she spoke softly but with weight in her voice. "You know I've always supported you, but are you sure you want to go that far?" Marcus gazed along the runway in the distance, where a plane was gaining momentum for takeoff. The sight reminded him of his mother's dreams, her words, and the times she had been treated unfairly yet still managed to smile. He spoke so softly that the wind could almost carry his voice away. "They dragged him off the plane simply because they didn't believe he could have been the one to buy seat 1A. Elena," he continued, "I'm not asking for revenge. I just want the world to know, never underestimate anyone just because they're not what you're used to seeing them as." Elena almost choked up. Then, "Let me lead the way." She said one last thing before hanging up. "Marcus, they don't know who they just messed with." Marcus chuckled softly. "They'll find out." While Marcus stood silently outside the airport on the other side of the country, Atlas Air's Chicago headquarters was like a beehive that had been violently crushed. Floor 19. Emergency Operations Room. The large screens displayed a continuous stream of red text, HRZ volatility halt. Another line read unusual market activity detected. And then came a series of automated alerts. Atlas Air CEO Thomas Kincaid, a man known for his cold and conservative demeanor, was running his hands through his hair at the meeting table. His tie was half untied, his shirt wrinkled, and his eyes showed panic. "Can someone explain to me why our stock just dropped 12% in 14 minutes? Kincaid yelled, his voice hoarse and strained. The CFO, trembling, replied, "Sir, there are rumors that Halestone Capital is reviewing its leasing agreement with us." "What rumors?" Kincaid slammed the table. "They have no reason." The meeting room door swung open. A legal officer rushed in his face, pale. "Sir, facts from Skyfleet Holdings. Urgent." He placed the stack of papers on the table. Kincaid snatched them, his eyes scanning quickly. And the moment he read the first line, Kincaid felt as if all the air had been sucked out of his chest. Notice of ethical violation due to offensive conduct against a senior shareholder. Contract Clause 1.1.3.9 has been activated. Next, here is the concluding sentence. Skyfleet Holdings will recall all 43 aircraft currently leased to Atlas Air, effective within 72 hours. The meeting room was as silent as a graveyard. Kincaid slumped into a chair. "Oh my God, what is this?" The chief legal officer turned to the last page and read aloud, his voice trembling. Signed by Marcus Hale. The entire meeting room fell silent. One person mumbled Hale. "Hale of Halestone Capital is he the one who was dragged off the plane this morning?" All eyes were fixed on the TV screen, broadcasting the news. Marcus was being dragged down the hallway, yet he remained, strangely calm. Kincaid felt a tingling sensation on his scalp. Why didn't anyone tell me he was a senior shareholder?" A manager replied, his face pale. "Because you've never seen the list of individual shareholders. Marcus Hale is the man behind the Skyfleet restructuring. Our leasing agreement was approved by him," Kincaid stammered. "Then, we're really doomed." In New York, Marcus got into a black SUV that Elena had arranged for someone to pick him up in. He sat inside the windows, reflecting the bustling crowds outside. The phone rang. Elena called back via video. Behind her was the Halestone conference room. Everyone was operating like a war center. "Marcus," she said, breathless, "we just got the news. Atlas Air has dropped 27%. Marcus looked down at his hands. The red marks of the handcuffs were still visible on his skin. He gently touched them as if touching a reminder. "Elena," he said, "send out the press release. But remember to be careful with the wording." "Understood." "What message do you want to convey?" Marcus looked out the window. The sunlight hit the car's rearview mirror, creating a thin streak of light. "Tell the world, no company is allowed to treat its customers badly. No airline is allowed to insult human dignity. And no one is allowed to judge others by the clothes they wear." Elena nodded, her eyes drooping but brightening with determination. "Marcus, people will never forget this day." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Me too." 2 seconds of silence. Then he spoke. "They pulled him out of seat 1A. Elena looked at him. "But now," Marcus chuckled softly, "I'll bring their entire airline down from the sky." As the SUV turned onto the highway, the sun began to set. The sky turned a reddish-orange as if the last rays of the day were illuminating every detail of Marcus's face. On the other side of the country, Atlas Air was plummeting. On this side, Marcus Hale sat quietly like a man who didn't seek war, but when war came to him, he would end it in a way the world would remember. The Chicago sky that day was a thick, gray blanket draped over the city. The winter wind seeped through the 19th floor windows of Atlas Air headquarters, blowing into the emergency operations room as if to remind everyone that a storm was approaching. But no one in the room had the presence of mind to feel the cold. On the big screen, Atlas Air's stock chart continued its downward spiral like an airplane losing lift. HRZ, down 33%, trading halted, volatility stop. #3 market alert, major airline experiences sudden devaluation. The atmosphere was one of chaos and despair. Assistants scurried back and forth, seemingly drawn into the vortex of disaster. CEO Thomas Kincaid stood in the middle of the room, his face pale, his eyes once sharp and confident, now filled with a pathetic panic. He leaned his hands on the table, breathing heavily as if oxygen were being sucked out of his lungs. "Call Skyfleet," Kincaid yelled. "Sir, They're not answering the phone, a staff member stammered. Call Hallistone Capital, call Marcus Hale. We tried. They didn't want to contact us. Kincaid slammed his hand on the table so hard that the coffee cup flew up and spilled onto the floor like a pool of blood. Oh my God, what do they want from us? What did we do wrong? It's just... A young assistant whispered. He dragged a senior shareholder off the plane. Kincaid spun around, glaring. I didn't pull him. I wasn't there. The assistant remained silent for a moment, then said softly, But you are the head. A sentence as light as a whisper, yet powerful enough to pierce Kincaid's last vestiges of confidence. He staggered and sat down in the chair. Oh my God. Hale. Hale. That name. The chief legal officer opened the documents in front of him, his voice trembling. There is a clause in the leasing agreement, clause 11.3.9. If a senior shareholder is insulted or mistreated by airline staff, Skyfleet is entitled to immediately recall the fleet without prior notice. Kincaid looked at him as if he were a ghost. Who agreed to those terms? The legal director blushed. Sir, it was you. 2 years ago. You said, we never mistreat VIP clients, so this clause doesn't matter. The whole room fell silent. Kincaid gasped for breath. He clutched his face, pulling it down forcefully as if trying to tear away the skin burning with shame. His voice was hoarse. I didn't think that situation could happen. No one said anything more. It wasn't necessary. An IT technician rushed in, his voice, urgent. Sir, here's the latest news. On the TV screen, Marcus Hale's face appeared in the CNN video frame. The press lights shone on his face, highlighting his calm, almost cold demeanor. A reporter asked Mr. Hale, do you want the airline to apologize? Marcus replied, his words brief but sharp as a knife. I don't need an apology. I need accountability. From whom? From people who think they have the right to decide who deserves which seat based on appearance. The Atlas Air meeting room fell silent, everyone holding their breath. The reporter continued, Do you feel your actions were too drastic? Recalling the fleet will render Atlas Air nearly inoperable. Marcus looked directly into the camera, his eyes deep but not angry. They dragged me off the plane. I just dragged them down from the positions of power they didn't deserve. Some people in the room almost gave up, having lost all hope of saving the situation. Kincaid muttered like someone who had lost their bearings. What should we do? What do we do now? The CFO swallowed hard. Sir, with this drop in price, if the market closes within an hour, we'll lose over $5 billion in market capitalization. A small groan escaped Kincaid's throat. He slumped into his chair as if the entire weight of a 40-story building were pressing down on his shoulders. Oh my God, all because of a chair. A chair. The legal director shook his head. It's not the chair, Thomas. It's the person you've messed with. Meanwhile, in New York, Marcus sat in Hallistone's temporary office atop the glass-enclosed building overlooking the city. The warmth from his herbal tea warmed his hands, creating a sense of peace that contrasted sharply with the chaos unfolding outside. Elena walked in carrying a stack of documents and an iPad displaying a series of bright red charts. Marcus, she said, Atlas Air just dropped 41%. Marcus nodded. Not happy, not bitter, just as expected. What about Skyfleet? He asked. They sent an official notification all 43 Atlas aircraft would be recalled within 72 hours. And Marcus... They followed every word. In the terms you wrote. Marcus looked out the window. The streetlights were coming on below. People hurried about calmly, completely unaware that in just 3 hours a major airline had gone from the heights of success to the depths of despair. Elena, he said, prepare for the press conference. Elena nodded but then paused, looking at him as if she wanted to ask something but wasn't sure if she should. What's wrong? Marcus asked, his voice soft. Marcus, I just want to know. Do you regret it? Marcus closed his eyes for a breath. Then he opened them, his gaze deep and intense. Elena, ever since I was little, I've always tried to be patient to avoid conflict. But sometimes patience makes people think they're accepting being treated badly. He set down his teacup and continued slowly. There are battles we don't choose. But when they come before us, we have to decide whether we will bow our heads or stand tall. Elena looked at him, her eyes softening. And this time, you chose to stand tall. Marcus smiled faintly. Not just for you. For people like you. for those who are looked down upon every day and have no voice. Elena took a deep breath. Then, we'll continue. Marcus returned to his desk and opened his computer. On the screen, the Atlas stock chart was still falling. The news will spread worldwide, he said, but hopefully what will spread even further is the lesson. A gentle breeze blew outside the window, carrying with it the distant sounds of the city. A rare moment of quiet. Then Elena said the final words, her voice low but firm. Marcus, people will say today is the day an airline collapses. She looked at him as if wanting to engrave this image into her memory. But I think this is the day a new standard is set. Marcus didn't answer. He simply closed his eyes, letting the wind carry away the lingering heaviness. Tomorrow will be a completely different chapter. A cold wind blew along the runway at Heathrow Airport like a harsh warning. It was late afternoon, the thin, golden rays of the setting sun casting long shadows like swords piercing the tarmac. But the plane that needed the most attention, Atlas 908, was located in a far corner where no commercial airline would want to be parked. It looks abandoned. And the people up there are about to find out why. In the cockpit, Captain Douglas Reed adjusted the microphone to call the ground, but the signal crackled incessantly, cutting off like a gasp for breath. London ground, this is Atlas 908. We're waiting for orders to proceed to the gate. The passengers are getting impatient. No response. Douglas frowned. This was unusual, very unusual. He turned to First Officer Liam Turner, the young pilot who had been with him for nearly 3 years. There might be a problem with the auxiliary radio system, try again. Liam followed suit, but the only sound they could hear was the rustling of the wind, like someone trying to whisper through the snowy screen of an old TV. Douglas tried a third time. Still no one answered. In that moment he felt something that seasoned pilots rarely admit. A mild fear, not the fear of an accident, but the fear that something bigger is about to happen. In first-class, middle-aged businessman Henry Caldwell kept checking his watch. He had an important signing ceremony in London. Being held up mid-air made him visibly annoyed. "Brenda!" he shouted toward the service compartment. "When are we going to get out of here? I didn't pay to be locked in this metal box." Chief Flight Attendant Brenda Hale quickly approached, trying to maintain a calm expression. "Sir, we are waiting for confirmation from the ground. Everything will be resolved in just a little while," Henry snorted. "You've been saying that for 20 minutes. Brenda wanted to say more, but the cabin lights suddenly flickered, then went out completely. The entire compartment went dark. Some passengers gasped in fear. Children began to cry. Liam sprang up from the pilot's seat. "Captain, we just lost power from the external supply." Douglas frowned. "That's impossible. They have no reason. No one would cut the power to a parked plane." Liam looked at him and whispered, "Unless." Neither of them spoke further, but they both thought of just one name, Marcus Hale. In the dim light of the cabin, Brenda tried to reassure the passengers with a small flashlight on the dashboard. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. This is a temporary situation. The backup system will restart shortly." But the subsystem didn't start. Not a sound of machinery, not a whirring of air conditioning, only the growing heat of the bodies and the tense murmurs of voices. Brenda walked toward row 2, where Mrs. Margaret Wells was trembling slightly with fear. "It's all right, Grandma," Brenda said gently. "Everything will be fine." Margaret took Brenda's hand. "Are you sure? I have a feeling like something more serious is happening?" Brenda hesitated. Deep down, she felt the same way. But she couldn't admit it. Not now. In the cockpit, all the screens were dark. Douglas pressed the power button 3 times, 5 times. Nothing happened. "Try APU," he said. Liam flipped the switch. A click sound was heard. Then, silence. No response. Douglas paused. "Liam, who has the right to cut off all the power like this?" Liam swallowed. "Only the unit that owns the aircraft." The air in the cockpit froze solid. Douglas whispered almost in disbelief. "You mean Skyfleet is actually recovering this aircraft right now?" Liam didn't dare look him in the eye. "Captain, it seems we've just been reported." Repo. From there, it fell into the cockpit like a blade. Shortly afterward, the sound of car engines echoed from afar. The yellow lights of a convoy of SUVs sped straight towards them. Brenda pressed her face against the window, her eyes wide open. "Is that the police?" one passenger exclaimed. "Oh my God! That's the property recovery team. They've finally arrived." Henry Caldwell jumped up from his chair. She said, "We were just a little late. She didn't say we were on a plane." That was about to be CZSD. Brenda didn't know what to say. She felt her face burning with embarrassment, even though she hadn't done anything wrong. But she knew that words would be meaningless at this moment. In the cockpit, Douglas gripped the steering wheel tightly. "I've been flying for 28 years, Liam, but not once have I been kicked off the very plane I was piloting." Liam looked at him, his eyes filled with both pity and bewilderment. "Captain, shouldn't we open the door for them?" Douglas sighed, his voice lowering. "If they come to take it, then locking this door won't change anything." He placed his hand on the latch that opened the cabin door. "Let's go. Let's face this like men." Liam nodded. When the door opened, a blast of cold air rushed in. The Skyfleet recovery team stood in a line, their reflective vests gleaming in the car's headlights. Leading them was a dark-skinned woman standing very straight, holding a clipboard. "Captain Douglas Reed?" she asked. Douglas nodded and stood at attention. "This aircraft is owned by Skyfleet Holdings. Atlas Air violated leasing clause 11.3.9. We are proceeding with an immediate recall." Brenda ran up, her voice choked with emotion. "And what about the passengers? We're still serving them." The woman replied, her voice soft but unwavering. "Passengers will be taken to the station by bus. But you," she looked deep into Brenda's eyes, "you are no longer a valid crew member for this aircraft." Brenda stood there speechless. Douglas tried to remain calm. "Can I speak to your superior? This is definitely negotiable." Before he could finish speaking, a deep voice came through the radio. No negotiation. The whole team turned to look at the black SUV that had just pulled up. The car door opened. A man stepped out. His long coat fluttered in the wind. The light reflected off his straight nose and calm face. Brenda's breath seemed to stop. Marcus Hale. No one on the flight crew thought he would show up. But he stood there in flesh and blood, looking at Douglas, then at Brenda, then at the bewildered passengers in the dark cabin. There was no hatred, no resentment, only a profound disappointment. Marcus walked over and stopped a few steps away from Douglas. "Captain," he said, his voice low and calm like a lake in the early morning, "I didn't do this to humiliate you, but I was forced to do it because of the choice you made that day." Douglas looked up at him, his eyes a mixture of self-respect and shame that he could not conceal. "I was wrong," Douglas said softly. "But please, don't punish the passengers. They're not involved." Marcus turned to look at the faces peering out from the dark cabin. He saw fear, confusion, and the reflection of himself that day when he was dragged away from Atlas 404. He took a deep breath. Then he said, "I'm not punishing them. I'm punishing the system that put them in this situation." He returned to the recovery team. "Get passengers into the station in priority vehicles. Don't make anyone wait any longer." Then he said something that made the atmosphere tense, but the flight crew, "Stay here. I need to talk." Inside the cabin, both Brenda and Douglas felt a tremor in their legs. Neither knew what Marcus wanted to say. What I feared most was not the shouting, not the threats, but it was his absolute silence. No anger, no shouting. There was only a terrifying calmness. That's when people realize they've truly lost everything. The evening breeze swept across the dark fuselage of the Atlas 908, like a long, drawn-out sigh of fate. No one on the crew imagined their lives could change so drastically in a single sunset on such a cold, desolate tarmac. But fate often chooses the most unexpected moments. The Skyfleet convoy reversed, leaving Marcus Hale standing alone at the foot of the metal staircase. The late afternoon light swept across his face, revealing more contemplation than anger. Brenda awkwardly stepped down first, her hands clasped tightly together as if afraid of dropping something important. Douglas followed his posture, stiff, his shoulders heavy as if weighed down by stones. Liam was younger, but the confusion on his face was even more apparent than the other two. They all stood in a short line as if they were attending a review meeting, rather than a regular gathering. Marcus stared at them for a long time. No words, no heavy breathing. Just observe. The silence made Brenda feel like her legs were about to give way. Finally, Marcus spoke. His voice was low and soft, yet heavy, like a steel door slamming shut behind him. "I didn't mean to humiliate anyone standing here." Brenda swallowed hard. Douglas looked down at his worn pilot's boots. Liam looked up, trying to maintain a respectful expression. Marcus continued, But I need the truth, the whole truth, not a report, not an excuse, not a story that's been altered to lessen the crime. The wind blew, carrying the sound of metal clanking from the airplane's stairs. Captain Reed. Marcus turned to Douglas. Tell me, what happened on Atlas 404 that day? Douglas took a deep breath. He looked at Marcus with the gaze of a man who knew he was wrong but had no intention of running away. I was wrong, he said simply. I was impatient. I let my ego get in the way of the process. And, he paused, I didn't treat you like a passenger. I treated you like a problem. Brenda quickly bowed her head. Liam swallowed hard. Marcus asked softly, why Douglas closed his eyes. Because I thought, you weren't the one who paid for that seat. It was a simple statement, but it pierced Brenda like a knife. She knew she had thought exactly the same thing. Marcus didn't get angry. He just nodded slightly. And you, Brenda. Brenda thought she had prepared herself for this moment. But when he called her name, his voice was so soft that it made her tremble. Sir, She took a breath. Telling the truth wasn't easy, but lying was even harder. I saw him wearing a hoodie. I saw him silent. I saw an image I've become accustomed to associating with troublesome passengers. She trembled even more. And I chose to trust Mr. Sterling simply because he was a regular customer. I didn't double-check. I didn't verify. I chose the quickest way to avoid trouble. Marcus asked, do you think I'm dangerous? Brenda was silent for quite a while. I don't know. I'm just assuming so. Marcus stared at her for so long that Brenda had to turn away. She felt her eyes sting and her uniform tighten around her back as if the past were weighing heavily on her shoulders. Liam, the youngest, tried to stand up straight. What about you? Marcus asked. Sir, I didn't interfere even though I felt something was wrong. Marcus looked deep into his eyes. Why, Liam swallowed. Because I'm afraid of losing my job. That statement was so truthful that Marcus let out a soft gasp. Thank. Marcus took a few steps, looking at the plane with its power off the afternoon light, casting shadows on its metal body like a large, unhealed wound. Do you know why I'm standing here? No one answered. Because they all knew, but no one dared to say anything. Marcus turned around, his voice lowering. Because I understand all too well what it feels like to be underestimated, to be doubted, to be judged simply by the coat you're wearing. The wind blew, causing Brenda's ID badge to flutter slightly. In 22 years as a flight attendant, Marcus said Miss Hale must have met thousands of passengers. But just one time she misjudged someone, and the whole system pays the price. Brenda burst into tears. Not a wail, just a few tears falling like mist. Captain Reed, Marcus continued, do you understand what hurts me the most? Douglas shook his head. Marcus looked at him for a long time. It's not about him kicking me out of my seat. Mr. Reed paused. It's not about him calling the police. He swallowed hard. Not even the fact that he let me be dragged across the airplane floor. Douglas held his breath. What hurts me the most, Marcus said, is that he never saw me as a human being who needed to be heard. Those words left Douglas devastated. His chest felt heavy, as if weighed down by a stone. After a long pause, Marcus continued, but I'm not standing here seeking revenge. Brenda looked up surprised. Douglas let out a sigh of relief. So what do you want? Douglas asked, honestly. Marcus replied immediately without thinking, I want change. Liam looked at him, his eyes wide. You want a new culture. Marcus nodded. No one is being fired today, he said slowly. But everyone will have to undergo retraining from scratch. Real training, not just for show, Brenda whispered. You aren't going to fire us. Marcus looked at her, his gaze neither soft nor harsh, just a rare kind of fairness. I don't fire people who dare to admit their mistakes, people who dare to face the consequences, and people who are willing to change. Brenda burst into tears again, but this time, it was out of relief. Douglas stood taller as if he had regained some of his lost honor. Liam breathed a sigh of relief, his young shoulders slumping in gratitude. But Marcus wasn't finished yet. He looked them all over and said, Tomorrow I will announce a complete restructuring of the airline. Atlas Air will no longer be Atlas Air. Douglas frowned. What do you mean? We're starting from scratch, Marcus replied. A new name, a new system, new rules, a new culture, Brenda whispered. Like a second chance. Marcus smiled slightly. If you want it, I'll give you the opportunity. Whether you seize it or not is up to you. Suddenly, the sound of an SUV engine starting could be heard from a distance. A Skyfleet employee ran over. "Mr. Hale," he called, "there's a group of reporters coming to the area. It seems someone has leaked the repo." Marcus closed his eyes for a second. The world out there doesn't wait for anyone. He opened his eyes and looked at the flight crew one last time. "Get in the car with me. I want everyone to listen to the rest together." Douglas nodded slowly. Brenda wiped her face with a napkin. Liam stood next to Marcus, looking like someone who had decided to take another step towards maturity. All three stepped onto the tarmac, following Marcus, the man who had been dragged off the plane just days before, now leading them through the most difficult moment of their lives. A strange journey, a beautiful paradox, and there's one thing we all feel. That day, they didn't just lose a plane, they were about to rediscover themselves. The Skyfleet convoy left the secluded tarmac, cutting through the late afternoon light that cast a pale yellow mist over Heathrow Airport. No one spoke a word during the short journey. Not because they lacked conversation, but because each was preoccupied with something greater than themselves. Marcus sat in the front seat, his back straight, but his shoulders subtly and almost imperceptibly slumped. In the rearview mirror, Douglas observed Marcus's silence as if he were looking at a man consumed by sorrow. In the back seat, Brenda sat by the window, her fingers gripping the seatbelt tightly. She had served on thousands of flights, faced countless awkward situations, but she had never met a passenger who made her feel both ashamed and impressed as Marcus Hale. Liam, sitting next to her, was still not coming to terms with the fact that the man who used to just wear a hoodie was now the one changing an entire industry. The train stopped in a side area of the station, a place with no passengers, no staff moving around, only yellow lights casting shadows on the cold concrete floor, and a few press vehicles parked in the distance. Elena Brooks, Marcus's assistant, was standing there waiting. She quickly opened the car door. "Marcus, the press is outside," Elena said quickly. "They're asking why there's a repo convoy on the runway and why the Atlas 908 was pulled into quarantine." Brenda closed her eyes. Douglas clenched his fist. Liam swallowed hard. Marcus, meanwhile, let out a deep sigh as if he had been preparing for this moment. "Let them in," Marcus said. Elena frowned. "Are you sure? They could twist the story. They could edit it." "They could." Marcus smiled slightly, but it wasn't a happy smile. "Elena, I was once dragged off a plane in front of hundreds of cameras. Nothing worse than that." Elena paused. She understood. Everyone understood. Marcus Quay sang Douglas, Brenda, Liam. "Today is not the day you have to remain silent." His gaze fell on all three of them, calm but sharp as a knife. "Today, I want everyone to hear how the world has perceived you all over the past 3 days." Brenda ran. She was scared, not scared of the press. Scared of seeing herself through the lens of society. 3 minutes later, the group of reporters entered the empty area, their cameras flashing like metallic eyes, scrutinizing everything. A curly-haired American female reporter holding a microphone stepped forward. "Mr. Hale, we have information that Skyfleet, a company belonging to Ellington Holdings, directly repo-operated the Atlas 908 at Heathrow, creating a situation unprecedented in the history of civil aviation." "Can you confirm this?" Marcus replied immediately, his voice calm but direct. "That's right." A wave of commotion erupted among the reporters. The female reporter then asked, "Is this related to the video of you being dragged off Atlas Flight 404 inches? New York last week?" Marcus didn't flinch. He looked straight into the camera. "Yes, but not for revenge. It's for something bigger." He slowed down his speech. "It is a system that has failed in its duty to respect human beings." Douglas looked down at the ground. Brenda clutched the tissue tightly in her hand. Liam placed his hands on his knees, trying to remain calm. The female reporter immediately spotted 3 people standing behind Marcus. "These 3 people, are they involved in this incident?" Marcus turned to look at the flight crew. "Yes," he said truthfully. "They were the flight crew involved in that incident. And today they stand beside me, not because I forced them, but because they chose to face the truth." Douglas looked up, surprised by the way Marcus was protecting them. Another reporter chimed in. "Captain Reed, do you have anything to say?" Douglas took a deep breath. His voice was hoarse but firm. "I made a mistake. I didn't listen. I didn't respect my passengers. And I take full responsibility." A series of shutter clicks rang out. Douglas had never been exposed like this to the media before. But strangely enough, He felt lighter. Brenda was also asked, Miss Hale, many people online are saying you've been prejudiced against passengers of color. How would you like to respond? The question was like a knife twisting into her weakest point, but Brenda didn't shy away. I let exhaustion guide my judgment, Brenda said, her eyes welling up with tears. And that led me to misjudge a person. I regret it. Those words were so sincere that even the reporters fell silent for a few seconds. Liam was then asked, You're young? Why don't you speak up when you see something wrong? Liam replied, his voice low but clear, Because I was afraid. But fear is not a reason to ignore justice. I understand that now. Marcus heard that and nodded slightly. And then the biggest question arose. Mr. Hale, what do you really want? Fire them. Sue the airline. Bring down Atlas Air. The whole area held its breath. The camera lights shone directly into Marcus's face. He looked into the camera lens without flinching, without fear, without anger. Only the truth remains. I don't want to destroy anyone, Marcus said. I want to fix things. The murmuring started again. Marcus continued. I want the aviation industry to understand that every passenger, regardless of race, income, or clothing, deserves at least a minimum level of respect. He stepped aside, revealing the flight crew behind him. They are not enemies. They are products of a culture that is fundamentally flawed. If I only punish them, I won't change anything. Brenda covered her mouth with her hand, trying to stifle her sobs. Douglas felt a pang in his chest. Liam took a deep breath. Marcus concluded, I stand here not to end an airline, but to begin a new era. The lights flickered continuously. The press was both surprised and unsure whether it was a dream or reality. The press conference lasted another 5 minutes, then Elena quickly escorted Marcus and the crew away from the media frenzy. When the metal door closed behind them, the noise died down. The space was empty and quiet, with only the weary breathing of the flight crew. Brenda wiped away her tears. Douglas stood tall, but his eyes were red. Liam looked at Marcus, his voice soft. Why are you protecting us? Marcus returned. And he said just one sentence. A sentence that the three people standing there would never forget. Because, if I hadn't believed that people could change then that day, I wouldn't have been able to get up after being dragged down the runway. A long silence. Beautiful, heavy, and deeply human. Douglas held out his hand. Marcus looked at him for a few seconds, then shook his hand. Brenda bowed her head in a trembling voice as she thanked him. Liam smiled faintly for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Marcus said, Tomorrow will be a long day. We'll start all over again. The door opened. A blast of cold wind rushed in, and together they walked towards the station lights like turning a new page. That morning in New York had an unusual gray hue. It wasn't raining, but everything seemed shrouded in a thin layer of moisture, making the light appear softer yet heavier. Elena Brooks stood in front of the Atlas Air headquarters building, once considered a proud symbol of American aviation. Today, it's like an empty shell that's been swept through by a storm. The revolving glass doors were still functioning, but the security was unusually crowded. Staff members paced back and forth, anxiously whispering to each other as if afraid to call out the name of a ghost. That ghost. Its name is Marcus Hale. When Ellington's black SUV pulled up in front of the entrance, everyone looked up. Some recognized him. Some had only heard his name in the news, but their expressions were the same. Anxiety, expectations, and a little bit of fear. Marcus stepped out of the car, his dark coat fluttering gently in the breeze. He didn't seem aggressive, not hurried. Just an unusual calmness enough to silence the small square in front of the building. Elena walked beside him, holding her tablet, quickening her pace to keep up with Marcus's slow but steady gait. Marcus, she whispered, all the senior staff have been assembled in the auditorium on the 5th floor. The press is being kept out of the gate. Marcus simply nodded slightly. Have Douglas, Brenda, and Liam arrived yet? He asked. They're in the small meeting room next to the auditorium, Elena replied. I think they're very nervous. Marcus said nothing more, because he understood. Today wasn't a meeting. Today is the day Atlas Air is being dissected from its roots. Stepping into the main hall, Marcus immediately sensed the shift in everyone's gaze. At JFK, they'd seen him as a victim. Yesterday, the press saw him as a game-changer. But here at Atlas headquarters, they saw him as a force of nature that had just demolished a building and was preparing to rebuild it from scratch. Some employees bowed, some stepped aside, and some avoided his gaze as if afraid of being seen through. Marcus didn't blame them. He understood they were also part of the old system, the system he was about to dismantle. As the elevator opened on the 5th floor, the noise from the auditorium poured in. The room was packed with over 300 managers at all levels, whispering and tense. The sign that read, Atlas Air Senior Management Assembly, hung on the wall, and spotlights shone down on the stage where a microphone stood ready. The atmosphere here is like the prelude to a courtroom silent, cold, and filled with an unnamed fear. Elena whispered. Should I let you know when you're coming? Marcus shook his head. No need. Just let them see. He walked into the room without warning. And as expected, the conversation among the hundreds of managers immediately stopped. The sound of chairs creaking, heavy breathing, and a few hushed calls. It's him, Marcus Hale, the new CEO. Oh my God, look. Marcus didn't react. He just walked straight onto the stage, his steps steady, unhurried, but not allowing anyone to stop him. Standing on the platform, he looked down at the sea of waiting people. No one said a word. There was only waiting, fear, mixed with hope. Marcus placed both hands on the wooden platform, his voice loud but soft. I know everyone here has heard a lot of rumors. A few murmurs arose in the back row. I also know many people think I've come to shut down this company. He paused for a moment. All of that is not true. The hall vibrated slightly like a collective breath. I didn't come to destroy Atlas Air, Marcus said. I came to save it from the very system you operate. Some faces flushed. Some bowed their heads. Others looked at each other as if wanting to react, but didn't dare. Marcus looked straight ahead at the front row where the members of the executive board were seated. Nobody here got fired today, he said. But don't celebrate too soon. He looked at them, his eyes calm but sharp. Because keeping my position will be much harder after today. The front seats shifted slightly. The senior executives were beginning to sense the truth. Atlas Air no longer belonged to them. They were in Marcus's house. Unexpectedly, an older man, Harold Nilsson, vice president of operations, stood up. Mr. Hale, he said, trying to keep his voice normal. Are you really going to restructure the entire airline just because of one incident on a plane? We've run it very well for years. Marcus raised his hand slightly as if cutting the sentence. Short. Mr. Nilsson, that incident didn't start on the plane. The whole room was silent. The problems start in boardrooms like this, Marcus said. From people making decisions based on short-term profits ignoring the people. From managers who think this year's performance is more important than the safety, respect, and dignity of passengers. Harold opened his mouth to argue, but Marcus continued, not giving him a chance. Atlas Air did not experience a crisis because a passenger was dragged off the plane. He looked around. Atlas Air is in crisis because its culture allowed it to happen. A few female managers nodded slightly. Some even breathed a sigh of relief, as if someone had finally said what they had always been thinking. Marcus stepped down from the platform and walked straight toward the center of the hall. Everyone moved aside, creating a natural path. Douglas Reed, Marcus called. Douglas emerged from the small waiting room and stood in the center of the meeting room. The yellow light of the hall reflected off his pilot's uniform, making him look both proud and weary. This Marcus stated clearly as someone who dares to admit his mistakes. The entire hall turned to look at Douglas. Some were curious. Some were skeptical. Some were admiring. He didn't lose his job, Marcus continued. He was given a chance to make amends. Douglas bowed slightly. At the far end of the room, a few young employees exchanged hopeful glances. Then Marcus called again, Brenda Hale. Brenda stepped out, her hands trembling but her steps more steady than yesterday. She looked at Marcus and a fleeting look of gratitude appeared in her eyes. She's not being laid off, Marcus said. She'll be participating in a retraining program that I'm planning to roll out to all employees, the people in the room murmured. Not because of surprise, but because many recognized themselves in Brenda's story, Marcus continued. Liam Turner. Liam stepped out younger, but his eyes were much stronger than they had been that afternoon at Heathrow. Marcus said he chose to remain silent when he shouldn't, but he's willing to change. The hall fell silent, listening to every word. Those three, they're not perfect, Marcus said, but they're brave. He turned around and looked at everyone. And what about you? Do you dare to be as brave as them? The question rang out like a steel bell. Everyone knew this wasn't just talk. This is a warning. It's the start of a wake-up call. Marcus didn't return to the podium. He stood in the middle of the room equal to everyone else, but everyone could feel the power radiating from him. Atlas Air is dead, Marcus said. But we have a chance to build something better. More transparent. More humane. He looked at Elena. Elena stepped forward and handed him a folder. Marcus opened it and pulled out a piece of paper. I officially declare, he said, that from today Atlas Air will be renamed. The entire hall leaned forward. Our Aliyah Air. The new name rang out, spreading throughout the room like a strong gust of wind. Something new. A future no longer bearing the mark of the old Atlas. Marcus said, Aurelia, a new dawn. A reminder that we can start again. Some people applauded. Then more and more people applauded. Not because they were forced, but because they felt something unprecedented from the previous leadership, hope. When the meeting ended, Douglas, Brenda, and Liam stood together in the quiet hallway. Brenda sighed. I didn't think I'd be named in front of 300 managers. Douglas chuckled softly. I didn't think I would survive that meeting. Liam looked at Marcus from a distance, his voice respectful. He is unlike any leader I've ever met. Douglas nodded. No. He doesn't lead with fear. He leads with truth. And Brenda whispered, her eyes welling up with tears. For the first time, I felt I had a chance to become a better person. Marcus walked past and overheard everything. He simply placed his hand gently on her shoulder. It starts tomorrow, he said. All 3 of you need to be there at 7 a.m. Douglas burst out laughing. Please, let us sleep here for 1 night. Marcus smiled slightly. I'm giving everyone 1 night, but no more. They genuinely laughed for the first time since they met. And as Marcus stepped out of the hallway, Elena approached him, her voice low. You know, after today, there will be more storms. Marcus gazed towards the glass gate where the morning light streamed in his eyes, deep but peaceful. Elena. It's normal for the sea to have waves. The important thing is that we know how to swim. That morning, New York had a crisp, early winter chill. Not a biting cold, but a chill enough to keep people alert enough to remind them that today was an important day. At Aurelia Air's new training center, the temporary sign was put up last night. The smell of paint still lingered in the air. But the most striking thing about the building wasn't the new sign, but the silence. A silence that seemed to suggest the entire place was waiting for something that would change everything. Douglas, Brenda, and Liam stood together in front of the glass door. Brenda clutched a small notebook, her hands cold, but her eyes filled with determination. Douglas stood with his arms crossed, the cautious expression of someone who had once been the cockpit master now standing before a classroom. Liam, being younger, seemed more relaxed, but there was still a hint of anxiety in his eyes. It's 7 a.m.? Really? Liam chuckled softly, trying to break the tension. Douglas looked at his watch. Marcus said 7 o'clock, which means exactly 7 o'clock. Brenda swallowed hard. I wonder what they'll make me study today. Douglas shrugged. I think we're about to be thrown into the fire. All 3 chuckled softly, a necessary laugh to keep them from the growing anxiety that was creeping in. The glass door opened. Marcus stepped out. No escort, no assistants, no media team. Just him in a simple shirt, his expression calm, but his eyes filled with the alertness of a man carrying a heavy responsibility. Good morning, Marcus, said his voice warm but firm. The 3 men nodded in greeting, and Marcus led them into the building. Inside the training room was surprisingly large. The space was airy, with white walls and natural light streaming through large glass windows. The electronic display board read, Rebuilding Trust, Rebuilding Training Course. What surprised them wasn't the modern equipment. It was the complete absence of any managerial positions. All the people present were flight attendants, pilots, and ground staff, about 40 people. These are the people who come into direct contact with passengers every day, and everyone looked at Marcus as he walked in, as if waiting to see how he would change their lives. Marcus stood in the middle of the room without a microphone. I didn't come to judge you, he began. I came to have a serious talk. He pointed to the text on the screen. Trust is not born from duty. Trust is born from how we treat each other. Brenda bowed her head, feeling the remark was directed straight at her. Douglas stood still, sighing slightly. Liam opened his notebook and jotted down every word. Marcus continued. We'll start with a simple exercise. But let me be clear, it might be uncomfortable for many people. A faint murmur spread. Marcus raised his hand. I want everyone to stand in a circle. No tables, no chairs, no social distancing. They followed suit. A large circle formed the morning light, illuminating each person's face. Marcus stood within the circle, not separated. "Good," he said softly. "First exercise, I want each person to share a moment in their life when they felt misjudged." The atmosphere changed instantly. Avoidant glances, heavy breathing, a few dry swallows. Brenda felt her heart pounding. Douglas squinted down at the tiled floor. Liam glanced at the other two, then back at Marcus. No one wanted to start. No one wanted to expose their wounds in front of their colleagues. Marcus looked around. "Let me begin," he said. The circle widened slightly, both surprising and intriguing. Marcus took a deep breath, then shared. "The day I was dragged out of Atlas 404, I vividly remember feeling like I didn't exist, not because they didn't know who I was, but because they didn't think I deserved respect." Several staff members lowered their heads. One flight attendant put her hand to her mouth, trying to suppress a gasp for breath. Marcus continued. "And the most painful thing wasn't being dragged in front of everyone. The most painful thing was when I looked up and saw that no one was on my side." Brenda felt like her heart was being squeezed when she heard that. Her eyes welled up with tears, but she tried to hold them back. Marcus looked at her very slightly, but very clearly. "Miss Hale, if you had just said one thing that day, just one thing, everything would have been different." Brenda couldn't take it anymore. She placed her hand on her chest and whispered her words, echoing in the circle, "I know, and I'm sorry. I was wrong." Marcus nodded, not forgiving immediately, but acknowledging. "Now it's someone else's turn," he said. "Who wants to share?" The atmosphere fell silent. Then, unexpectedly, a ground staff member, Carlos, who had never spoken before, raised his hand. "I will speak." All eyes were on him. Carlos spoke slowly. 10 years ago, when I first started working here, a passenger looked at me and asked, "Do you speak English, or are you just pushing a luggage cart?" He clenched his fists. That day I felt invisible, as if I were nothing more than a uniform. Some people nodded, a familiar pain. Carlos looked at Marcus. "So, when I saw your video, I understood immediately. I understand the feeling of being looked down upon." Marcus nodded, his eyes softening. That was the moment he wanted everyone to feel the shared pain. Douglas stepped forward. "I also want to say something." The whole room fell silent. Douglas took a deep breath. "Back when I was a young pilot, a captain once told me straight in front of the crew, 'You're not skilled enough to fly this steel bird.'" He pursed his lips. I didn't reply, but that thought stayed in my head for 3 years, and I swore I would never let anyone else feel that way. He bowed his head, but then, that day I did something worse. Brenda placed her hand on his arm. No words, but a complete understanding. Finally, Liam spoke up. "I grew up in a small town. There, people believed that only the elderly could lead, only those with years of experience understood the profession. I was seen as inexperienced, lacking a voice. Even if I spotted a problem, I didn't dare speak up." He looked at Marcus, and so I remained silent when I should have spoken up. After more than an hour of sharing, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. It was no longer about the flight crew, no longer about management or ground staff. Just human beings with their wounds, mistakes, and opportunities for change. Marcus looked around, his gaze softening. "This," he said softly, "is why I want training to start with people. Because if we don't understand each other, we can't understand the passengers." He paused for a moment. "But the morning has only just begun." A few people chuckled softly. Marcus pointed to the large screen. "This afternoon we'll move on to the more difficult part. Simulation of failure. Simulating a failure scenario." Douglas raised an eyebrow. "Are you planning to have us reenact that day?" Marcus replied without evading the question. "This isn't meant to torment you. It's to help you understand the true impact of a wrong choice." No one answered. But that silence, it was no longer fear. It was readiness. Marcus looked around the room. "Aurelia Air is not the rebirth of an airline. It is the rebirth of all of us standing in this room." He smiled faintly, a rare smile. "Today we delve into the wounds. Tomorrow we learn to fly again from scratch." As the morning drew to a close, Douglas approached Marcus and whispered, "Thank you for not abandoning us." Marcus's answer was very simple. "I don't save perfect people. I just give opportunities to those who dare to change." Brenda looked at him, tears welling up in her eyes, but her smile was genuine. "I won't disappoint you again." Marcus gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "Just don't let yourself down, that's enough." Liam was smiling with energy. I'm ready for the simulation this afternoon. Marcus turned to him. Good, because that will be the hardest part. The three of them looked at each other, then at Marcus, like a group of pilots preparing to take to a new sky. A sky that belongs not just to Aurelia Air, but it belongs to their own lives. That afternoon, after an emotional training session, the sun gently shone. The golden light of the setting sun filtered through the large windows of the Aurelia Air Training Center, creating long, warm streaks on the floor, as if the sky itself wanted to witness this moment of change. Marcus stood in the simulator control room, where a reenactment of the incident on the Atlas 404 was ready. The space was darker, with only a few LED lights on the soft light enough to create the tension of a real cockpit. Douglas sat in the captain's seat. Liam was in the first officer's seat. Brenda stood in the compartment just like she did that day. Everyone was silent. It wasn't fear. It was because they knew this moment was important. It wasn't just a test. It was a moment for them to confront themselves for the last time. Marcus stood behind the observation glass. He gave no orders, no instructions, no interference. He let them reenact the situation themselves. The simulator lit up. Virtual passenger voices filled the air. Arguments, annoyance, everything was recreated so accurately that Brenda had to clench her hands to keep herself from bursting into tears. In the simulation, a virtual passenger representing Marcus sits silently in the front seat. Douglas took a deep breath. Liam turned, waiting for orders. Brenda approached the passenger model, but this time her voice was very different. Sir, it seems the system is reporting a seat mapping error. I'll check it again. Thank you for your patience. Douglas looked at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes filled with respect. The simulation continues. Virtual passengers complain. The system creates time pressure. The loudspeaker announces that doors are about to close. It all seems to push them back into the confusion that once led them astray. But this time, they were calm. Douglas said over the interphone, Brenda double-check, "No one is being moved until we're certain." Liam added, "If there's a double booking, prioritize passengers who have boarded through the proper procedure." Brenda double-checked, and in the simulation the system displayed the following message: "Passenger full fare. Status verified." Brenda placed her hand on her chest, took a deep breath, and then said the words she hadn't said that day. "Sir, I apologize for the delay. Thank you for waiting." No flowery words. Just a simple apology, but it was something she never gave on that fateful day, and that, quote, is beautiful. Simulation has ended. The whole room lit up again. Douglas took off his headset. Liam relaxed his shoulders. Brenda wiped away a tear that had just fallen. Marcus walked in. No applause. No congratulations. He just stood there for a moment looking at them, with the gaze of someone who had finally seen what they had been hoping for. That he said softly, but his voice resonated. "That's the kind of person I believe you can become." Brenda burst into tears. Douglas nodded vigorously as if in promise. Liam breathed a sigh of relief. Marcus looked at them. "Starting tomorrow, you will officially be the first flight crew of Aurelia Air." The three of them almost froze. They didn't expect it. They didn't think they deserved it either. Douglas was the first to speak up. "Marcus, are you really trusting us?" Marcus replied immediately without thinking. "If I didn't trust you, I wouldn't have called you to this training session." Brenda put her hand to her mouth as if she couldn't believe it. "Will you give us a second chance?" Marcus looked at her, his eyes sincere. "It's not just a second chance. It's a chance to start over in the best way possible." Aurelia Air's first flight was 3 days later. JFK Airport was bustling with activity. A Boeing 787 had just been covered in a shiny new decal, Aurelia Air, a new horizon of humanity. The sound of cameras. The sound of television. The murmurs of awe from the passengers. Marcus stood near the boarding gate, not making a grand entrance, giving a speech, or doing any PR. He simply stood quietly, observing the new and old employees, working with smiles he had never seen at Atlas before. Douglas walked by, his newly tailored uniform impeccably neat. He stopped in front of Marcus. "You know what Douglas said," his voice soft but sincere. "I've been flying for 28 years, but I've never felt as proud as I do today." Marcus smiled, because today, he's not just flying a plane, he's leading a new culture. Douglas placed his hand on his chest as if making a promise. Brenda approached. For the first time in days, her eyes were bright and clear, devoid of fear. "Marcus," she said, "I know I can't change the past, but I promise, no passenger boarding Aurelia Air under my service will feel inferior to anyone else." Marcus said softly, "Just remember one thing. People don't pay to get there. They pay to be treated like human beings." Brenda smiled. This time it was the most beautiful smile Marcus had ever seen on her face. Liam arrived later rather hastily. "Captain told me not to drop the checklist again," he laughed. Marcus looked at him, nodding proudly. "You're young, but you learn quickly. That's more valuable than any degree." As passengers began boarding, a dark-skinned boy about 8 years old pulled over Marcus's arm. "Uncle, are you the guy on TV?" Marcus smiled gently. "What do you think?" The boy looked at Marcus, then at the airplane with the Aurelia logo behind him. "I think you're the one who can make this beautiful airplane fly." Marcus chuckled, not loudly, but genuinely from the bottom of his heart. He sat down at the same level as the boy. "You can't make the plane fly," he said. "The people inside are the ones who can." The boy asked. "What do you do?" Marcus replied softly. "I'm just helping them remember that when we treat others well, the sky seems so much bigger." The boy nodded, as if understanding something far more profound than his age. As Aurelia Air 001 rolled out of the gate, Douglas said over the intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Aurelia Air's inaugural flight. Thank you for flying with us on our journey to build fairer skies." The passengers applauded. Meanwhile, Marcus stood at the terminal window watching the 787 slowly taxi onto the runway. No moment in his life has been as peaceful as this one. No revenge, no bitterness, no resentment. This is just the beginning. Elena stood beside him, holding a report in her hand. "Marcus," she said, "you know, not every CEO chooses this approach." Marcus kept his eyes fixed on the plane. "Elena, people build airlines to transport people. And me, I built Aurelia to transport dignity." Elena smiled, softly, full of pride. Marcus added, his voice lowering, "That day, they dragged me off the plane like a piece of unwanted luggage. But today, I know I've brought something more important into the sky." Elena asked. "What is it?" Marcus replied, Faith. The 787 began to move. The engines roared softly. The afternoon sun reflected off the fuselage, glinting like a silver arrow preparing to pierce the sky. As the plane lifted its nose into the air, Marcus gently closed his eyes, not to avoid the light, but to savor the moment that he knew would stay with him for a lifetime. The moment a man who was once dragged across the runway brought an airline back to the skies through kindness and perseverance. And before leaving the station, Marcus stopped in front of the camera that was recording the group of latecomers. He said softly, "If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been wrongly judged, if you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere, then remember one thing." He looked directly into the camera. "You don't need permission to stand up. You just need to stand up." A small smile, full of power. Then Marcus turned away, leaving behind the lights, the cameras, and the noisy world. Before him lay the future of Aurelia Air, and a sky was opening up. If you've heard this far, thank you, I really do. Stories like Marcus Hale's journey aren't just for entertainment. They remind us that sometimes a single moment of being looked down upon can change a life, and if we rise up in the right way, it can change the world. If this story resonates with you even just a little, please give the video a like, so the algorithm knows that humane content still has a place in people's hearts. If you think there's someone out there who also needs to hear about the power of self-respect, perseverance, and the ability to rise above injustice, please share this story with them. And if you want to continue following these profound, emotional, and deeply human journeys, please subscribe to the channel. That will give me more motivation to tell kinder more beautiful and more authentic stories. Thank you for staying. See you in the next story.